Earl Anthony Wayne is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. His diplomatic service included time as U.S. ambassador to Mexico and Argentina. He left the State Department in 2015 as a career ambassador, which is the most senior U.S. diplomatic rank. He joins us today to talk about a new publication he's authored called A North American Workforce Development Agenda. Tony, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Let me ask you about the skills gap that you identify, that you call alarming in the piece you've written, which is sort of the pretext for the proposal you're making. What is happening to the workforce?
Well, what's happened is that there's been a lot of transformation in the workplace, and people have been worried that they were losing jobs overseas. But when we started looking at it more carefully, we found out that people were losing jobs because there was a big gap in the skills they needed to do the jobs in today's industries, whether they be services or manufacturing. There is a big skill gap. Well over 40%, 46% questioned in a recent poll of U.S. executives looking for people said we couldn't find the skills that we needed. We couldn't find the people that we needed. And then we looked, and surprisingly, there was a similarly high number in Canada, and even in Mexico, a high number of people that just couldn't find the right workers to meet what they needed. And that included both technical skills and soft skills.
Where is the breakdown? Why aren't we training for the jobs of 2018?
Well, I think we started to look into that, and what we found is that there are a lot of academic institutions that are training the way they've trained for a long time. Mm-hmm. And the workplace has been changing. We have all these waves of technology sweeping through, which demand higher technical skills, but they also demand the sort of human variation of skills to be able to communicate, to work with others in a digital technology. And that's even true for entry-level workers now. You can't just go in and be a store clerk without having some level of digital skill.
It's almost what I'm hearing is that we've been training in a linear way, and there's a need for nonlinear skills as well.
That's right. And it's not just training, it's how you think about your workforce also. And this is only going to accelerate as technological change continues to bring very rapid change to the way that people work and the way that they have to think and have to be competitive.
So speaking of how rapidly it's changing, we were discussing this before we began recording the interview, this graph on page 5 of your publication about the percentage of workers that might need to change occupation by the year 2030. And in the U.S. alone, that's 54 million people, or 32% of the workforce.
That's right.
A stunning number.
What's going to happen is some jobs will be eliminated, but a lot of them are just going to be redefined. You'll keep part of that old job, but you're going to need new skills to be able to carry out that old job in its new form. And so what that means is you'll have a lot of displacement unless these workers find ways to get retrained. And it shouldn't all just be on the worker. I mean, there's always going to be some on the worker. You have to go out and get that new skill and develop it and study. But also in the workplace, they need to build in, as a CEO or a manager, training to your workforce. You're going to just have to do that on a regular basis.
So who's responsible? You know, I think we focused in the last decade on global markets and free trade and knocking down barriers, and led by industry and government. And then there were this whole group of people who needed to be retrained but weren't being retrained. So is it the employers who are responsible? Is this a government project? Is this a big public spending? How do we address it?
Well, it really has to be all those stakeholders coming together and figuring out best practices and ways to make it happen. There's some role for governments, both federal, national governments, and local governments, to help provide some incentives to facilitate. But businesses also have to be willing to talk and think about the skills they're going to need, not just today, but in 5 years and maybe 10 years. Then educators at local institutions, whether they be a 4-year college or a 2-year college, have to be willing to work with employers in their areas, with local mayors, with other skill intermediaries at times too, just to develop new means for quick training of those who are already working. Mm-hmm. And then they have to tailor that training for the young people coming through, either out of high school into apprenticeship programs or through junior college into some of these work and learn at the same time programs, or special skills that they know the businesses in their area need.
Wow, that's complicated.
It is very complicated. Once we started looking into this in the United States at first, we were amazed by how complicated it is. And we really don't have a national view on this across the United States. Same thing in Canada, same thing in Mexico, we discovered. You have pockets of excellence where people have developed good models for doing this. And then there's no place to bring all those excellent examples together and share them more widely to learn from each other.
You know, we talk so much about jobs and the need for good jobs and the economy. We never stop. And yet, why are we missing this?
I think in part because it is complicated, and what it means is that federal government, state government have to work together. They have to work together with academic institutions and with the private sector, and that's not easy to bring them all together. So what we're proposing in part is creating those spaces where federal governments, local governments, private sector, and universities and colleges can come together, can establish can see what the gaps are, start agreeing on some norms, some definition, can learn from each other. And that's what's needed.
And as we turn up the degree of difficulty, you're talking about doing this coordination trilaterally, coordination between 3 companies or countries. And you'd like to see this written into a new NAFTA, is that correct?
I would. I'd like to see it as part of a new NAFTA. There's a competitiveness chapter in NAFTA. I think it's going to be part of North America being competitive, more competitive in the world if we can do this right, if we can get best practices. And the competition's not going to ease up. Mm-hmm. You know, China and other global producers are going to keep doing their very best to produce better and less expensively than we do. They're going to work hard at educating their people. And if you look at the education rankings around the world, we're way down in the middle of the pack. And then there was a recent study done on how ready are countries for automation, the waves of automation coming. South Korea was at the top of the list. Canada was down at number 9, and then the United States was further down, and Mexico was way down, which is not as surprising because it's a poorer country overall. But there's a lot to do to get ready for this, and we just aren't ready yet.
Speaking of those who are doing better and in search of those best practices, what can we learn from those who are ahead of us in this game?
Well, I think there's a lot. We can look at their education system. We can look at what's the dialogue between the private sector and that education system. We can learn what government does to facilitate that. We have a certain model. We're not Switzerland, we're not Germany, where they have apprenticeship programs that have long been built into their societies. There's something we can learn from them, but we aren't going to duplicate their systems. But we can learn what do they do well. South Korea is a place that was, in my lifetime and your lifetime, a developing country.
Right.
Now it's right there at the top of the list. And so they do a lot of things in their education systems that are excellent. And we should look at that, and we shouldn't be at all ashamed about taking the best out of that and doing the best we can to replicate those good practices.
You talk about creating a resilient workforce, or usually resilience is a term used when we're talking about the environment, but you think that it applies to individuals.
We need to be resilient, because what's going to happen if you look at any of the projections is we're just going to keep getting hit by waves of new technology. Now this is fun and good because it helps our daily lives, but as you know, change is hard and learning new things is hard. And you need that opportunity. We don't all have a son or daughter who's going to come in and show us when a new technology arrives. This is how you do it, Dad.
Right.
And that's what our workers are going to need. And it's going to be sometimes our sons and daughters that have to learn this new technology also. And so there needs to be that space, that understanding. It needs to be built into the business process and the career process. We talked about lifelong learning. It is lifelong learning, but you'll need little spurts of, 3-week training courses for this new software that's come in, how to make it work and how to make it really benefit the company and yourself. And that just has to be part of the new model.
You're describing a cultural paradigm shift.
It is, very much.
The way we think about ourselves and how we relate to the notion of work.
It is. And some of it is applying some of this new technology to understanding the skills that are needed and the data that's needed. For example, one of the things we recommend is that the governments, the federal governments across North America, have common definitions and common approaches to the data they collect about jobs, about skills, about where the demands are, and how they share that in real time to people all across the country. Just think of being a high school counselor and trying to advise students on what they should study. What are the skills that are going to be needed in 5 years? It's really hard to do that. So governments could help, aided by the private sector, because there are companies like LinkedIn and others that want to provide this data. But if we can have a better database that covers the continent, what the needs are, and helps project what are the upcoming needs, that can really help people all across the country, from high school students to that 40-year-old who wants to look for another opportunity in his or her field somewhere else in the country. And there may be a need in that country, and if we can get that data clearly available, that can really help.
Or has to look, not not wants to look.
Or has to look, exactly.
While you're into specifics about some data collection and transparency, one of the things you recommend. Another is apprenticeships. You mentioned that earlier, but exactly what would that mean in this context?
Well, I would talk bigger, sort of working and learning at the same time. One of the big programs is apprenticeship, and that's usually for coming out of high school. And you go and work for part-time, and you're still finishing your high school diploma, and you're learning at school and on the job at the same time. And traditionally that's been in the trades in the United States, plumbing, carpenters, electricians. But the idea is that could be in a wider area also, and that's what they have in Switzerland and Germany, which are the most advanced countries in the world in these systems. But then if you go beyond that, you're going to have these opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, to learn partway through your career. Maybe after 5 years, a whole new technology comes in, and everybody in your factory or in your software company just needs to take some time, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a little longer, to learn this new technology. That has to be built into the business model, and the schools need to be available, let's say a community college nearby, to give to these people who already have bachelor's degrees perhaps, or higher, sort of update courses on how to do this. And we just need to have these systems ready to go, these models that work, so it can really meet the needs of the companies and the workers, and more broadly the whole economy as we're competing.
Tony, it's fascinating, it's visionary. So when are you running for office? I should just tell our viewers that, if you don't mind, I'll borrow your copy. This is available on our website free of charge. Like most things here at the Wilson Center, we make it available to the public as part of our charter. So if you'd like to read the entire report, I'd encourage you to log on to the Mexico Institute website and get yourself a copy. Where do we go from here? Final thought. Those are big picture, visionary, aspirational ideas, seismic ideas, but sort of on the next steps level, the practical level. How do you move this forward?
Well, you have to find some champions at different levels and in different places.
That's why I was suggesting you run for office. You would become one.
It would be great to have some interest at the national level, and if you could just get the idea built into the NAFTA, that would help. But it doesn't have to go into NAFTA. It could go in parallel to it. But in order to work, you need a space where people can facilitate these meetings of the various actors in the process to figure out what are the best practices, where are the gaps, where should we have a shared definition or a shared approach, for example, to apprenticeship. And if you can get that working, that will be great. There are some states in the United States that have really good examples of this, some provinces in Canada, and a couple places in Mexico too. But we have to regularly bring them together so we can all learn from each other. And some of those other places that are experiencing economic problems and skill shortages can learn from the others and start doing and practicing some of that. So it really is getting some champions for the importance of this process.
Push us to that tipping point.
It is. Yeah. And we really owe it. You mentioned earlier how so many people got left behind in the first 15 years of this century, and that's true. And the politicians from both parties left them behind. In the United States, there was just not a satisfactory answer. So let's get some satisfactory answers now.
I'm all for it. Thank you. This is terrific work, and I appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be with you.